Hello, Intro to Philosophy students. I wanted to give a quick introduction to the lecture you are about to watch. I wanted to let you know that I'm reusing a lecture that I recorded for a different class last semester. So the dates are not going to be right in the beginning of the lecture. And there's an abrupt ending because I had to cut out the last section because it's not relevant to you all. But otherwise, the lecture is just what I would have wanted to say about this article that you were assigned for this week, which is about Indigenous and feminist ethics of care. The reason I wanted to keep this lecture the way I recorded it originally is that in the lecture you'll see I am demonstrating caring for an infant as I lecture about the ethics of care. So I couldn't really recreate this because my sweet baby Ozzy is now too old. That's who co-stars in this lecture. But I wanted to share with you the lecture as I recorded it originally on this essay. So without further ado, I will hand it over to my past self to take it away. Hello. I was just watering my tomatoes. Taking care of them so they can nourish me. Let's go inside. Come on. Today we'll be talking about Indigenous and feminist ethics of care. Taking up right where we left off from our discussion of moral theories last week. Specifically, in this week's lecture, we'll be asking, what is an ethics of care? We'll look at the connection between ethics of care and environmentalism. And then we'll consider indigenous and feminist perspectives. And finally, talk about what's to come in the next few weeks. So for starters, what is the ethics of care? Well, from this piece that we're discussing today by White and Cuomo, they tell us a definition, according to them, is that ethics of care is approaches to moral life and community that are grounded in virtues, practices, and knowledges associated with appropriate caring and caretaking of self and others. So, ethics of care is ethics that centers care, caring relationships as the center. We can consider the differences between traditional ethics, which we were talking about last week, which is mainly Kant and utilitarianism as our paradigmatic examples. We can compare those traditional views to the ethics of care. On the traditional views, if you'll recall from last week, we take ethics to be about isolated agents, isolated in the sense that they're making decisions for themselves, by themselves, making their own decisions. It's impersonal. You remember from utilitarianism that each person counting no more than any other person is an important principle of utilitarianism. So it doesn't matter who you're connected to or related to on the utilitarian view. You have to take everyone's happiness equally seriously. That's the sense that it's impersonal. It doesn't matter whose happiness it is. It's universal in the sense that the rules that we're talking about should apply to everyone in similar circumstances. It's abstract. We're trying to move away from all the particular details of a situation and think of abstract rules or principles that we can live by and that can apply in any situation. And it's based on reason, in the sense that we're using reason to understand morality, to give reasons for the moral views that we have, and and for formulating our moral beliefs. Ethics of care, on the other hand, is affective in the sense that it's about emotion. Interdependence, how we're connected to each other. It's about our relationships, who we care about, who we love. And context matters. So it could be that one rule that applies in one specific circumstance would not apply in a different circumstance. Caretaking is very important on this kind of ethical view, and attachment, connection. The fact that we are all attached to one another in various ways. Okay, according to ethics of care, care is seen as sort of the basis of our social fabric. Why we need to cooperate and work together is because we care about each other. We have people in our lives that we love, and we try to build societies up from there. In a way that sort of diminishes this tension between personal and political, between what's personal and what's public, because care is personal. You care about people you actually know, people who are in your life. And that's what sort of shapes our moral conceptions in the public sphere on this view. Okay, according to ethics of care, women may have particular epistemic insights, kind of special knowledge of what care is about. And that's because women have traditionally been more likely to be in caretaking roles. But it's important on this view that this perspective, this wisdom or special knowledge that women are supposed to have is accessible to everyone. Okay, we're going to talk about that idea a little bit more because there are a lot of different controversies within that question. Okay, so we have some principles of the ethics of care. The first one being the value of ecological interdependencies. How we're all connected and interdependent, not just people around you, but connected to nature and connected to the world, and the state of nature and the state of the world that we live in. And by the world, I mean all of our surroundings, everything that's out there that has any effect on our well-being and us on the well-being of it. All of these things are interconnected and matter for understanding the value of care. Okay, another principle of the ethics of care is caring for non-humans in ecological systems, which is kind of related to what I just said. Okay, care ethics is often diminished, is not taken seriously, and the authors attribute this to colonialism, racism, and sexism. Okay, we'll talk about sexism and racism more. By colonialism, they're talking about people who invaded a space and colonized the people who were living there, either killed them or made them leave or made them slaves, otherwise set up their own society where other people were already living. It's considered precognitive also, rather than knowledge forming. What's that mean? It means that care ethics is considered to be sort of not something that you think through. This is a criticism of care ethics, that it's sort of another way that it's diminished and not taken seriously, is that it's not something based on thought, it's not something that gives you knowledge, it's not knowledge forming, it's just kind of emotion based, which means you can't really think it through, you're just acting on your feelings. And traditionally, environmentalism is often focused on rights and stewardship and economics. I'm going to pause for a second. Sorry to have to break up these videos. It really gets on my nerves, but I was having some technical difficulties and lost the second half of the lecture that I just recorded. But starting back where I hope it left off. So I was talking about how ethics of care is rarely taken seriously. perhaps due to colonialism, racism, and sexism. We talked about that. This idea that it's considered pre-cognitive as a way of diminishing the ethics of care, saying you haven't really thought about it, it's just your feelings, you're just acting on feelings. It's somehow inferior to acting on the basis of reason. That's how it's considered. And that goes along with denying that you can actually form knowledge, get to know things, and develop wisdom through caring. These are standard critiques of the ethics of care, along with a version of environmentalism that's focused on individual rights and stewardship and economics, does not see the ethics of care as a legitimate basis for taking into account our ecological interconnectedness. One question that I want to ask is about the connection between environmentalism and biomedical ethics. I just want to sort of ask that question as something that you should be thinking about throughout the duration of this lecture and maybe into the rest of the course, because there are close connections between these two concepts. We're going to talk a little bit about them within this slide. But for your term paper, one of the assignment for the term paper is to identify intersections within the class, and that's one intersection that might be worth exploring more deeply in a paper, is how is environmentalism linked to our health and well-being? We're going to talk specifically about the degradation of the environment in indigenous communities and how that's impacted their health disparities. Okay, so moving on to indigenous perspectives about care ethics. What's wrong? You don't like me talking to this computer? Do you want to say hi? What about all your toys? This one likes to go a long way. Are you thinking about going to get it? Thinking about it? This is one of your favorites. Your sour cream. And your big bowl. And here's your lid. Who are we talking about when we talk about indigenous perspectives? Well, indigenous people are the leading environmentalists. We're going to look a little bit briefly, and the paper goes into more depth at environmental movements involving indigenous communities, started by indigenous communities. We're talking about communities who governed themselves before a period of invasion or colonization, okay, such as Native Americans in our country. And it's about 370 million people around the world. We can look at some of the basic principles underlying an indigenous ethics of care, beginning with awareness, and that's awareness of our place in a complex web of relationships that involve people we're connected to and the people we care about, as well as people we don't know at all, people on the other side of the world who are affected by the decisions we make, as well as non-humans, including animals and bodies of water and forests and other ecological systems. So this first principle is just being aware of that, being aware that we're not isolated individuals, but we're actually interconnected to all of these different systems. And all these systems are interdependent. We depend on one another. We need each other, just like we need clean water and clean air in order to live. And that leads to reciprocal responsibilities. So we have responsibilities to our surroundings, and our surroundings have responsibilities to us. As an example, in this piece, we get this idea of water's duty to the rest of creation, duty to nourish and hydrate the rest of creation, and our responsibility not to interfere with water's responsibility to us. Indigenous ethics of care is virtue-based in the sense of prioritizing virtues. We talked about virtues in the last lecture. Virtues such as wisdom, the wisdom especially of elder populations, and attentiveness, again, attention to our surroundings, just being in general an attentive person and aware of what's going on around you. We have a principle of restorative justice through relationship building. Restorative justice is about communities that have been harmed because of injustice, such as when a community gets sick because of a mining operation that's going on nearby, or other ways that communities as a whole, people are harmed by unjust practices. Restoring those harms, healing from those injustices through building relationships with one another. And we have another principle of viewing political autonomy as a right to take care and protect the land that you live on. Okay, here's the point about the connection between environmentalism and biomedical ethics, and that is that the way we treat the environment, specifically the way we degraded the environment, ruined or harmed the things in our environment because of colonialism, because of invading colonies that come and displace people and kill them and harm them and enslave them, disrupt the relationships that existed in those communities before the colonizers arrived. Okay, and that has health disparities on the populations that are harmed, such as, in the case of indigenous populations, they've been displaced by the formation of national parks, had reproductive capacities harmed, so pollution affects their ability to reproduce and procreate. Indigenous populations are some of the first populations to be permanently relocated because of climate change, caused by what we consume and corporate practices. What we consume, meaning the things we shop for and buy and throw away. And finally, they've had their own land and water degraded by extraction and chemical industries. Now, I'm going to spare y'all the diaper change, but share with you that that has become necessary just as of a moment ago. If we were all in the classroom together, you might be aware of that too. There you are. So I'm going to pause and hope that I'll be able to pick up where I left off. Okay. Okay, so rather than putting their ideas into philosophical papers, a lot of the time indigenous communities and ideas are put into actual political declarations and movements for change. As there are tons of examples of these in the reading that you were assigned. But two I wanted to mention are, first, the Anchorage Declaration, which I took this quote from, and the quote is, to reaffirm the unbreakable and sacred connection between land, air, water, oceans, forests, sea ice, plants, animals, and our human communities as a material and spiritual basis for our existence. You can see in this declaration and in the other declarations that are discussed in the paper how these declarations of principles and ideas draw on the main principles that I presented at the outset characterizing the Indigenous perspective on care ethics. Okay, so be on the lookout as you read more of these examples of the declarations from Indigenous communities, of how the principles get taken up in the writing that they presented. And political movements, okay, so it's not just these declarations that they pronounce, but it's also actual movements to change practices, to protect communities and to protect the environment. And one of these is the Mother Earth Walk, started by a group of grandmothers in response to ongoing pollution and the misuse of water. And that Earth Walk sought to raise consciousness of water's sacredness, our interdependence with water, and the reciprocal responsibilities that connect humans, water, and other beings. Okay, so just a good statement of the relevance of these movements and how they draw on the principles discussed at the outset. See your picture in the window. Pausing for a little caretaking in action. Next up, feminist perspectives. We have another set of principles here, starting with the fact that we are essentially embedded and interdependent. We live within contexts. We live within communities and natural systems, and we're embedded in those, and we're dependent on each other and on those systems, and they on us. We see as foundational within this feminist framework mutually beneficial caring relationships. Okay, we all benefit from the caretaking that we do. I know that this particular relationship has benefited me immensely. It's important to this view that most care work is done by females and subjugated people, and we're going to talk more about the controversy surrounding that idea in a moment. Again, care ethics is drawing on virtues, what it takes to be a good person, moral habits, and character traits that provide us with flourishing relationships. Moral questions are contextual. What context we're in matters, and details of the context that we're in are important for deciding the answers to moral questions. And we get caretaking, again, as a form of restorative justice. We talked about that when we looked at the Indigenous perspective. Okay, this is the controversy. So within feminist care ethics, there's been research to establish a link between gender and different perspectives on ethics. So the idea is that males have a more justice and rule-oriented ethical framework, and females have a framework based on caretaking and responsibilities that arise from our relationships. However, that research has also been challenged. One challenge raised is that if we view this distinction in this way, this idea that males have one way of thinking about ethics, females have another way of thinking about ethics, we're actually limiting women within an oppressive and sexist society to fulfill those kinds of positions in our society, subservient positions of caretaking. But a response to that challenge is to say that no, actually, being a caretaker is not a subservient position. It's a valuable part of our society and a source of wisdom, and it's actually should be elevated, not seen as sort of a diminished role in life. So here's another place where there's a really interesting controversy and dialogue back and forth here that I've only scratched the surface of, and it's a great paper topic to look more deeply at if you are interested in thinking more about the association of caretaking and relationships, the association between that and feminine or female values. And one thing I would add about that is that I just said feminine, female. I've used the word women and men and male and female, and I am using those for now without much care. Those terms sort of just picking whichever one suits me for what I happen to be saying, even though we could spend a whole class talking about the differences between the male-female distinction on the one hand and the man-woman distinction and how those two concepts are connected, this idea of sex, being male or female, and gender, being a man or a woman. These are all questions and issues that I don't have time to go into within this lecture, but I'm not using those terms carelessly. I'm just not having time to explain all those relationships. Also related to the feminist perspective is the idea of using a feminist care ethic as a basis for environmental ethics, for environmentalism. So ecofeminism is a term that relates feminism and environmentalism, bringing those two together. And the way that care ethics provides a basis for ecofeminism is by centering caring for the welfare of others, specifically non-human animals and ecosystems.